Breathe. Please. Breathe.
The music died a sudden, discordant death, replaced by the heavy thud of Paul Green hitting the marble floor. In his high-end gray suit, he looked less like a titan of industry and more like a broken statue, his gold watch catching the chandelier light for a final mocking glint. The enforcers stood back, frozen in rigid, observant poses near the grand staircase, their expensive shoes rooted to the spot as if the tragedy were contagious. The witness gripped his glass, his face a mask of wide-eyed terror, paralyzed by the sudden vacuum of power. Into this vacuum of high-status apathy stepped Amanda. Her dark blue uniform rustled as she broke the invisible barrier between the servant and the master. While the wealthy stood still, calculating their losses or catching their breath, the maid moved with a singular, desperate grace. She dropped to her knees, her white apron spreading like a shroud over the cold stone, as she pressed her calloused hands against the billionaire's silent chest. The room gasped, not because a man was dying, but because the invisible woman had finally dared to be seen. "Get her away from him!" one of the enforcers barked, his voice cracking the stunned silence of the hall. But Amanda didn't flinch. She locked her elbows, the weight of her entire life pressing down into Paul's unresponsive chest in a rhythmic, desperate thrum. 1, 2, 3. The lead doctor reached for her shoulder, his face a mask of professional finality, but she wrenched herself away. "He's still in there," she hissed, her eyes burning with a fierce, grieving focus that stopped the men in their tracks. She leaned close to his ear, whispering the prayer her father had used when the world felt cold. "Breathe, Paul, breathe." Sweat beaded on her forehead, dripping onto her white apron as the seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. Just as a security guard moved to drag her back, a jagged, wet gasp tore through the billionaire's throat. His gold watch rattled against the marble as his hand spasmed, clutching at the air. The room went white with shock. The man pronounced dead was fighting his way back, anchored to the world only by the rough, steady hands of the woman they had never bothered to name. The doctors moved in like a frantic tide, their expensive equipment chirping in a sudden, rhythmic chaos that replaced the silence of the grave. They checked the monitors with trembling hands, their faces pale as they looked from the rising oxygen levels back to the woman in the blue uniform. "There is no medical explanation," the lead doctor whispered, his voice shaking as he watched the billionaire's chest rise and fall with a ragged, beautiful life. Paul was alive, but as the medical team swarmed, Amanda remained on the floor, her white apron stained with the sweat of her labor. In the shadows of the staircase, the witness did not join the cheer. His face, caught in a dramatic close-up, was a map of pure terror. His eyes darted from the breathing man to the maid, realizing that his silent victory had been snatched away by the person he had never considered a threat. The room hailed a miracle, but in the cold eyes of the inner circle, the miracle looked a lot like a death sentence for their secrets. When Paul's eyes finally flickered open in the sterile white light of the recovery suite, they didn't search for his lawyers or his board of directors. He ignored the enforcers who crowded the doorway with rehearsed expressions of relief and the witness who hovered at the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as he adjusted a sharp suit. Paul's gaze, clouded but sharp with a primal instinct, cut through the room until it landed on Amanda. She stood in the corner, her dark blue uniform wrinkled and her white apron stained, once again trying to fade into the shadows. As the head doctor began to speak, Paul raised a weak, shaking hand, pointing a finger directly at her. "Her," he rasped, his voice a dry echo of the man he used to be. "She stays." The room went cold as the inner circle shifted uncomfortably, but Paul's grip on Amanda's calloused hand was surprisingly firm. He didn't know why he felt a chill when his executives approached, but he knew that the only reason he could still feel the warmth of the sun was because this woman had refused to let him go. The following morning, the estate felt less like a home and more like a besieged fortress. Paul slept fitfully upstairs, but in the grand hallway, the enforcers had already begun their assault. The lead executive, his sharp suit crisp and his voice like freezing rain, blocked Amanda's path to the kitchen. "Your services are no longer required, Amanda," he said, his eyes hard and dismissive as he stared at her dark blue uniform. "The family has hired a private medical firm. We've packed your things." He held out a check, a bribe disguised as a severance, while the other men in black suits stood in rigid, observant poses behind him, forming a wall of expensive fabric and cold intent. They moved to usher her toward the service entrance, their hands hovering near her shoulders with a practiced, intimidating weight. They wanted the witness to the miracle gone before Paul could find his voice again. But as they pressed her toward the door, Amanda felt the weight of the billionaire's hand still lingering on her palm. She didn't take the check. Instead, she looked at the witness, whose face was still tight with the terror of her presence, and she stood her ground. Amanda didn't leave. She retreated into the one thing that made her powerful, her invisibility. While the enforcers believed they had intimidated her into silence, she moved through the service corridors like a shadow, her dark blue uniform blending into the dim lighting of the mahogany-paneled halls. Near the library, she paused, her breath catching as she heard the low, jagged voice of the witness. "The maid is the only problem," he hissed, his tone stripped of the polished veneer he wore for the cameras. The dosage was perfect. He should have been cold before the paramedics arrived. Amanda leaned against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. It hadn't been a random heart attack. The witness in the sharp suit and the men in the rigid, observant poses had orchestrated the fall of the king. They hadn't just watched him die. They had ensured it. As she clutched her white apron, the weight of the secret felt heavier than the billionaire's body. She wasn't just his savior anymore. She was the only person who knew the estate had become a crime scene. The silence of the service hallway felt like a physical weight, pressing against Amanda's chest more heavily than the billionaire's motionless body ever had. She looked down at her hands, calloused, trembling, and hidden in the folds of her white apron, and felt the crushing gravity of her own invisibility. How could a maid, a woman in a dark blue uniform whose name was never spoken, stand against men in sharp suits who moved the world with a whisper? The witness and the enforcers had money, lawyers, and the terrifying calm of people who had already decided Paul's story was over. If she spoke, they wouldn't just fire her. They would erase her. She flinched as a floorboard creaked, her mind racing through the trauma of every time she had been told to stay in her place. Yet, every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of Paul's hand clutching hers. A silent plea from a man who had everything but was now as vulnerable as she was. The apron felt like a leaden shroud, but the life she had pulled back from the brink demanded she find a voice she didn't know she possessed. The following night, the air in the recovery suite turned sterile and sharp with a hidden threat. Amanda watched from the shadows as a new nurse, sent by the witness, approached Paul's bedside with a syringe filled with a clear, lethal finality. The enforcers stood in their rigid, observant poses by the door, their eyes fixed on the hallway to ensure no real help arrived. Amanda noticed the tremor in the nurse's hand, a stark contrast to the calm precision of a true healer. Just as the needle touched the 4-line, Amanda stepped into the light, her dark blue uniform a sudden bolt of defiance against the clinical white of the room. "That isn't his heart medication," she said, her voice steady for the first time. She grabbed the nurse's wrist, her calloused fingers locking like iron. In the ensuing struggle, the syringe shattered against the marble floor, and the witness recoiled, his face twisted in a dramatic close-up of exposed guilt. The medical error was no longer a mistake. It was a confession. Amanda had pulled Paul back from the edge again, but this time the world was watching. 1 week later, the marble hall of the Green estate was filled not with the scent of lilies, but with the cold, sharp air of a reckoning. Paul Green stood at the head of the long mahogany table, no longer the broken man in a gray suit, but a titan reborn with a terrifying clarity in his eyes. The witness and the enforcers sat in a row, their faces pale as Paul threw the shattered remains of the syringe onto the table, a jagged glass confession of their betrayal. "You all watched me die," Paul rasped, his voice cutting through their rehearsed excuses like a blade. "But you forgot that the walls have ears, and the shadows have hearts." With a single sweep of his hand, he signed the documents that stripped his board of their power, firing every man who had stood in rigid, observant poses while his heart stopped. Then he turned to Amanda, who stood by the door in her dark blue uniform. "The world calls you a maid," Paul said softly, his hand finding hers. "But today you are the foundation." He announced the creation of the Amanda Grace Foundation, placing the invisible woman in charge of the very empire that had once tried to erase her. Years passed, and the marble of the Green estate no longer felt like a cold monument to power, but a place of warmth and open doors. Amanda eventually hung up the dark blue uniform, but she never lost the quiet, watchful focus that had once saved a life. As the head of the foundation, she became a different kind of protector, walking the city's poorest wards to find the invisible children before they fell through the cracks. Beside her, Paul moved with a slower gait, his gold watch now a reminder of the time he had been gifted rather than the money he had made. They were an unlikely pair, the man who had everything and the woman who had nothing, yet they stood together as the city's heart. Sometimes, when they passed the grand staircase where the enforcers had once stood in rigid, observant poses, Paul would catch Amanda's hand and squeeze it. There were no more sharp suits or wide-eyed terrors, only the steady rhythm of a life well lived. Amanda was no longer a ghost in the shadows. She was the light that had taught a billionaire how to truly see.